The stagecoach rattled into Enid, Oklahoma Territory on a scorching July afternoon in 1893, carrying 3 mail-order brides and 1 woman who had paid her own way. Sitting quietly in the corner with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes downcast beneath a worn bonnet. Owen Calloway stood outside the general store with his hat pushed back, watching the dust clouds settle as the driver pulled the horses to a stop. He had not sent for a bride. That was his business partner, Frank, and 2 other ranchers from the neighboring spreads who had pooled their money to bring women west. Owen had told them he was not interested, that he had his hands full running cattle and breaking horses, but Frank had insisted he come to town anyway. "Just look," Frank had said that morning over burnt coffee. "You have been alone too long, Owen. A man needs more than a horse and a campfire." Owen had not argued because Frank was right, even if Owen was not ready to admit it. At 27, he had spent the last decade building something from nothing, carving out a life in territory that still felt raw and untamed. He had a small ranch, 100 head of cattle, and a reputation for being fair but hard. He also had a scar that ran from his left eyebrow to his cheekbone, courtesy of a spooked Mustang, and a manner that most folks described as distant. The 3 brides stepped down from the coach first, each one prettier than the last, with careful ringlets and dresses that had seen better days but still held their shape. They looked around nervously, clutching their bags, until Frank and the other 2 men stepped forward with broad smiles and introductions. Owen hung back, ready to head to the saloon for a drink before riding home, when he noticed the 4th woman. She had not moved from her seat inside the coach. The driver had already climbed down and was unhitching the team when Owen walked closer. "Miss," he called up, "this is the last stop." She lifted her head slowly, and he saw her face for the first time. She was not beautiful in the way the other women were, with their painted lips and carefully styled hair. Her features were plain, her brown hair pulled back severely, and her dress was a faded gray that seemed designed to blend into the background. But her eyes caught him. They were green, the color of new grass after rain, and they held something he recognized because he had felt it himself: loneliness. "I know," she said quietly. Her voice was soft, barely carrying over the noise of the street. "I was just gathering my courage." "Courage for what?" She climbed down carefully, holding a single carpet bag that looked like it contained everything she owned. When she stood in front of him, the top of her head barely reached his shoulder. She did not meet his eyes. "For starting over," she said. "For trying to be seen." Before Owen could ask what she meant, Frank appeared at his elbow, grinning like a fool. His own bride was blushing prettily beside him, a blonde woman named Caroline who looked like she had stepped out of a painting. "Owen, you old dog, I knew you would change your mind," Frank said, gesturing to the woman in gray. "This must be the 4th bride. Come on, let us all go to the hotel and get everyone settled." "I am not a mail-order bride," the woman said, finally looking up. She met Frank's eyes, not Owen's. "I paid my own passage. I am looking for work." Frank's grin faded into confusion. "Work? What kind of work?" "Anything honest. I can cook, clean, sew, keep books. I worked in a boarding house in St. Louis before I came here." "Why Enid?" Owen asked, surprising himself. He had not meant to engage, but something about her quiet determination drew him in. She finally looked at him, really looked at him, and he saw the weight of years in her expression. "Because no one knew me there, and no one knows me here. I thought perhaps that meant I could be anyone I wanted." "Who were you in St. Louis?" Frank asked, but Owen waved him off. "Frank, take your bride to the hotel. I will help this lady find what she is looking for." Frank looked like he wanted to protest, but Caroline was tugging on his arm, and the other couples were already heading down the wooden sidewalk. He shrugged and followed, leaving Owen alone with the woman in gray. "I did not ask for your help," she said, but there was no heat in it, just a statement of fact. "I know. I am offering anyway." Owen picked up her bag before she could stop him. It weighed almost nothing. "There is a boarding house 2 streets over, run by a widow named Mrs. Henderson. She might have work and a room." "Why are you helping me?" Owen started walking, and after a moment she followed. "Because I know what it feels like to be invisible," he said. "And because you look like you have traveled a long way to get here." They walked in silence through the dusty streets of Enid. The town was small, barely 5 years old, built on land that had been opened for settlement in the land run of 1893, just months earlier. Everything still had that new, rough quality. Buildings thrown up quickly to serve the flood of settlers staking claims. Owen had been one of the first, riding hell for leather across the prairie to claim his 160 acres, sleeping with his rifle for the first 6 months, until the claim was secure. The boarding house was a 2-story frame building with a porch that sagged slightly on one side. Mrs. Henderson answered the door herself, a formidable woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled into a tight bun and shrewd blue eyes that took in the situation immediately. "Owen Calloway," she said, "I heard you were not in the market for a bride." "I am not. This lady is looking for work." "I thought you might need help." Mrs. Henderson looked at the woman in gray, who met her gaze steadily. "What is your name, girl?" "Emma Bryan," she said. "I am 24, healthy and hardworking. I can provide references from my previous employer, though the letter will take time to arrive." "And why did you leave St. Louis?" Emma hesitated, then lifted her chin slightly. "Because I have been invisible my whole life, and I wanted to see if I could be different somewhere else." Mrs. Henderson's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Invisible. I know something about that. My husband saw me, truly saw me, for 30 years. When he died last winter, I realized no one else ever had." She stepped back from the door. "I do need help. The boarding house is full, what with all the new settlers. I can offer you a room in the attic, 2 meals a day, and a small wage. The work will be hard. I am used to hard work." "Then come in. Mr. Calloway, thank you for bringing her." Owen tipped his hat and turned to go, but Emma's voice stopped him. "Wait." She was looking at him now with those green eyes, and he felt something shift in his chest. "You said you know what it feels like to be invisible. How did you change that?" He thought about the years of proving himself, of building something real with his hands. "I stopped waiting for people to see me. I started making noise they could not ignore." Emma nodded slowly, like she was filing that away for later. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway." "Owen," he said. "Just Owen." "Thank you, Owen." He walked back to where his horse was tied outside the general store, but his mind was not on the supplies he needed or the long ride back to the ranch. He was thinking about green eyes and quiet determination, about a woman who had traveled hundreds of miles to reinvent herself in a place where the land itself was being reinvented. Frank caught up with him as he was checking the saddle cinch. "So, you did not want a bride, but you found one anyway." "She is not a bride. She is a woman looking for work." "She is a woman, and you noticed her. That is more than I have seen from you in all the years I have known you." Frank clapped him on the shoulder. "Caroline and I are staying in town tonight, getting to know each other properly. You should do the same with Emma. I barely know her. Then get to know her. Owen, you are a good man, but you are going to die alone if you keep building walls around yourself." Owen swung into the saddle, looking down at his friend. "Maybe I like my walls. No one likes walls. They just get used to them." Owen rode out of town as the sun started its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that made the prairie look like it was on fire. But he could not stop thinking about Emma Bryan, about the weight of loneliness he had seen in her eyes, about the way she had said she had been invisible her whole life. He knew that feeling. He had grown up the youngest of 5 brothers in Texas, always the smallest, always the one people overlooked until he was 16, and his parents died of fever. His brothers had divided the small family farm among themselves and told Owen he was old enough to make his own way. So he had, drifting north through Indian Territory, working cattle drives and breaking horses, saving every penny until he had enough to stake a claim when the Cherokee outlet opened. He had made himself visible through sheer force of will, building a reputation as someone who kept his word and worked harder than anyone else. But Frank was right. He had built walls too, thick ones that kept everyone at a distance. It was easier that way, less painful when people inevitably left or died or decided he was not worth their time. But something about Emma had slipped through those walls, just a little, in the space of a 10-minute conversation. The next week passed in a blur of work. Owen spent his days mending fences, moving cattle to better grazing, and breaking a wild Mustang he had caught in the hills. The Mustang was a gray mare with a stubborn streak and intelligent eyes, and working with her took all his concentration. By the time Saturday rolled around, he realized he needed supplies and had a legitimate reason to go back to town. He told himself it had nothing to do with Emma buying. Enid was busier than it had been the previous week. More settlers had arrived and the streets were crowded with wagons and people. Owen tied his horse outside the general store and went in to order flour, sugar, coffee, and ammunition. While the clerk was filling his order, he heard a familiar voice. "No, I am sorry, but I cannot extend more credit. You already owe for last month." Owen turned and saw Emma behind the counter at the far end of the store. She was wearing a simple brown dress with a white apron, her hair still pulled back severely, but there was color in her cheeks now, and she stood straighter than she had when she arrived. The man she was talking to was Red Johnson, a drifter who did odd jobs around town and drank away most of what he earned. He was leaning over the counter in a way that made Owen's jaw tighten. "Come on, sweetheart," Red said, his voice wheedling. "Just a little credit. I will pay you back when I get paid for the livery job." "I am not your sweetheart, and the answer is no. If you want to discuss payment arrangements, you can speak with Mr. Peterson when he returns. I am speaking to you, and you are going to give me what I want." Red reached across the counter and grabbed Emma's wrist. Owen moved without thinking. He crossed the store in 4 long strides and put his hand on Red's shoulder, spinning him around. "She said no," Owen said, his voice low and dangerous. Red let go of Emma and backed up, his face flushing red. "This is none of your business, Calloway. It became my business when you put your hands on her. Apologize. Like hell." Owen did not hit him, though he wanted to. Instead, he stepped closer, using his height and the scar on his face to his advantage. "Apologize or get out and do not come back." Red looked at Emma, at Owen, then back at Emma. "Sorry," he muttered, then turned and stalked out of the store. Owen waited until the door slammed before he looked at Emma. She was rubbing her wrist, not meeting his eyes. "Thank you," she said quietly, "but I could have handled it." "I know you could have, I just thought you should not have to." He paused. "Are you all right?" She finally looked up, and there was something fierce in her green eyes. "Yes, I am used to men like that. You should not have to be used to it. Perhaps. But the world is what it is, not what it should be." The clerk called that Owen's order was ready, and he went to pay and load his supplies. When he came back, Emma was helping an older woman pick out fabric. She moved efficiently, her hands quick and sure, but she still had that quality of trying to take up as little space as possible, of making herself small. He waited until the woman left before approaching the counter again. "How are you settling in?" "Well enough, Mrs. Henderson gave me this job in addition to my work at the boarding house. She said Mr. Peterson needed help with the bookkeeping, and I have a head for numbers. That is good. You deserve good things. She studied him with those two old eyes. Why do you care? It was a fair question. Owen was not sure he had a good answer. Because I think we are the same, you and I. We have both spent too long being invisible, and we both know how much that costs. Something shifted in her expression, a crack in the armor she wore. It costs everything, she said softly. It costs your whole self. Before Owen could respond, the door opened and a group of cowboys came in, loud and boisterous. Emma immediately retreated, both literally and figuratively, stepping back from the counter and dropping her gaze. Owen watched her transformation with something like pain in his chest. This woman who had just stood up to Red Johnson, who had traveled alone across half the country to start over, was making herself invisible again, and he hated it. He left without buying anything else, but his mind was working. Frank was right. He had noticed Emma, really noticed her, in a way he had not noticed anyone in years. And more than that, he wanted to help her see herself the way he was starting to see her, not as invisible, but as someone worth looking at. Over the next month, Owen found more reasons to come to town. He needed supplies. He had to check on a horse he had sold to the livery. He wanted to hear if there was news from the territorial government about statehood. Each time, he made sure to stop by the general store, and each time he saw Emma. They developed a friendship of sorts, though it was conducted mostly in brief conversations over the counter or on the street. He learned that she had grown up in an orphanage in Ohio, that she had never known her parents, that she had spent her whole life being told she was plain and unremarkable. She had worked as a maid, a seamstress, a cook, always in the background, always forgettable. I thought if I could go somewhere new, I could be someone different, she told him one afternoon when the store was quiet. But I am starting to realize I brought myself with me. I am still the same person. That is not true, Owen said. You stood up to Red Johnson. You have 2 jobs. You are making your own way. Because I have to, not because I am brave. Bravery is not the absence of fear. It is doing what needs to be done despite the fear. That is what you do every day. She looked at him with something like wonder. How do you see me that way? Because I pay attention. The words hung between them, and Owen realized he had said more than he intended. But Emma did not look away. She held his gaze, and for the first time, he saw something other than loneliness and resignation in her eyes. He saw possibility, but before either of them could say anything else, Mrs. Henderson bustled into the store looking for Emma. There you are, dear. I need you back at the boarding house. We have a new guest arriving, and I need help preparing the room. Emma nodded and untied her apron. As she passed Owen, she paused and said, very quietly, "Thank you for paying attention." Then she was gone, and Owen was left standing in the general store, his heart doing something strange in his chest. Frank noticed, of course. A week later, he rode out to Owen's ranch unannounced and found him working the gray Mustang in the corral. The mare had come a long way, accepting a saddle and bridle, though she still shied at sudden movements. "You are in love with her," Frank said without preamble, leaning on the fence. "I am working with a horse, not in love with anything," Owen replied, not looking at his friend. "I am talking about Emma Bryan, and you know it." Owen guided the mare through another turn, then brought her to a stop and dismounted. He removed the saddle and let her loose in the corral before he finally looked at Frank. "What if I am? Then do something about it. Ask her to dinner, court her properly, marry her. I barely know her. You know her better than Caroline and I knew each other, and we are doing fine. This is the frontier, Owen. People build lives with less." Owen walked toward the house, Frank following. Inside, he poured them both coffee and sat down at the rough table he had built himself. What if I am not what she needs? What if you are exactly what she needs? What if she is exactly what you need? Frank leaned forward. Owen, I have known you for 5 years. In all that time, I have never seen you look at anyone the way you look at her. You see her and she needs to be seen. That is not nothing. It is not enough. Then make it enough. Build something with her. That is what you do. You build things. Frank left an hour later, but his words stayed with Owen. That night, lying in his narrow bed and listening to the coyotes howl in the distance, Owen let himself imagine what it would be like to share this life with someone. To come home to Emma waiting to hear her voice in the morning, to learn all the things about her he did not yet know. It terrified him. But it also filled him with something he had not felt in years: hope. The next Sunday, Owen put on his best shirt and rode into town. He knew Emma had Sunday afternoons off from both her jobs, and Mrs. Henderson had mentioned in passing that Emma liked to walk along the creek that ran east of town. He found her there, sitting on a flat rock with her shoes off and her feet in the water. She had let her hair down, and it fell past her shoulders in soft brown waves. She looked young and almost happy, and Owen felt like he was intruding on a private moment. But she must have heard his horse, because she turned, and when she saw him, her face lit up in a smile that made his heart stutter. "Owen," she said, standing quickly and brushing off her skirt, "I did not expect to see you here." He dismounted and tied his horse to a nearby tree. "I was hoping I would find you. I wanted to ask you something." She waited, her hands twisting together, that old nervousness creeping back. "Would you have dinner with me? There is a restaurant in town, nothing fancy, but the food is good." Emma stared at him like he had spoken in a foreign language. "Dinner? You want to have dinner with me?" "Yes." "Why?" Owen stepped closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. "Because I enjoy talking to you, because I want to know more about you. Because you make me feel less invisible, and I hope I do the same for you." Her eyes filled with tears, and for a horrible moment, Owen thought he had said the wrong thing. But then she smiled, really smiled, and it transformed her whole face. "Yes," she said, "I would like that very much." They had dinner that night at the only restaurant in Enid, a small place run by a German couple who served hearty food at reasonable prices. Owen had been there before, but it felt different with Emma across the table, her face soft in the lamplight, her guard slowly coming down as they talked. She told him about the orphanage, about how the other children had called her Mouse because she was so quiet, about how she had learned to read from a kind teacher who saw something in her that no one else did, about the years of working in other people's houses, always on the edges of their lives, never part of anything. "I used to imagine what it would be like to be the kind of person people noticed," she said, pushing her food around her plate. "The kind of woman men wrote songs about or fought over. But then I would look in the mirror and see just plain Emma, and I knew it would never be me." "You are not plain," Owen said, and he meant it. The more time he spent with her, the more he saw. The intelligence in her eyes, the strength in the set of her jaw, the grace in her movements. "You are like the prairie in spring. Easy to overlook if you are not paying attention, but beautiful if you take the time to really look." She ducked her head, but he could see the pink spreading across her cheeks. "You have a poet's soul, Owen Calloway. I have never been accused of that before." They talked until the restaurant closed, and then Owen walked her back to the boarding house. At the door, Emma turned to him, and in the moonlight she looked almost ethereal. "Thank you for tonight," she said. "For seeing me. Thank you for letting me see you." He wanted to kiss her, but it felt too soon, too presumptuous. So he just touched her hand briefly, feeling the calluses on her fingers from hard work, and then he stepped back and tipped his hat. "Can I see you again?" "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, you can." Over the next 3 months, Owen courted Emma properly. He took her on picnics by the creek, taught her to ride the gentle bay mare from his string, and brought her wildflowers that grew on the prairie. She made him laugh with her dry observations about the boarding house guests and challenged him when he got too set in his ways. Slowly, she began to change. Not in any dramatic fashion, but in small ways that added up. She stopped wearing gray and brown, choosing instead dresses in soft blues and greens that brought out her eyes. She wore her hair down more often. She spoke up in conversations instead of fading into the background. She became, Owen thought, more herself, and Owen changed too. He found himself smiling more, looking forward to town days instead of dreading them. He talked about the future, about plans for expanding the ranch, about maybe building a real house instead of the small cabin he lived in now. He let his walls down, brick by brick, until Emma could see all of him. The lonely boy, the driven young man, the person he wanted to be. It was early October when Owen realized he was going to ask her to marry him. They were sitting by the creek, the same spot where he had found her that Sunday afternoon, and she was leaning against his shoulder, comfortable and quiet. "I need to tell you something," Emma said suddenly, her voice serious. Owen felt his stomach drop. "All right." She sat up and turned to face him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I'm afraid." "Of what? Of this?" "Of you. Of what happens when you realize I am not special, that I am just Emma, and you stop seeing me the way you do now." Owen took her hands in his, feeling how cold they were despite the warm afternoon. "Emma, I do see you. I see how hard you work. I see how kind you are to Mrs. Henderson, even when she is in one of her moods. I see how you save part of your wages to send to the orphanage where you grew up, because you want other children to have what you did not. I see your strength and your courage and your heart. And I see that you are afraid, but you are here anyway, letting me in despite that fear. That is what makes you special. Not because you are some impossible ideal, but because you are real and brave, and you choose to be vulnerable even when everything in your life has taught you to protect yourself." Tears were streaming down her face now, but she was smiling. "I love you," she said, the words spilling out like she had been holding them back for too long. "I did not mean to, and I tried not to, but I do. I love you, Owen." He kissed her then, finally, tasting salt from her tears and feeling her hands grip his shirt like she was afraid he would disappear. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers and said the words he had never said to anyone else. "I love you too. I have loved you since the day you stepped off that stagecoach and told me you wanted to be seen. Marry me, Emma. Build a life with me. Be visible with me." "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, yes, yes." They were married 2 weeks later in the small church that served Enid and the surrounding homesteads. Frank stood up as Owen's best man, and Mrs. Henderson stood with Emma, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. The ceremony was simple, just the words that mattered, but when the preacher said Owen could kiss his bride, and Emma looked up at him with her whole heart in her eyes, Owen felt like the richest man in the territory. The reception was held at the boarding house, Mrs. Henderson insisting and refusing to take no for an answer. Half the town showed up, bringing food and well wishes. People who had barely noticed Emma before came up to congratulate her, and Owen watched with fierce pride as she stood tall and accepted their kindness without shrinking away. As the sun set and the party wound down, Owen and Emma rode out to the ranch together. Emma riding the gentle bay mare and Owen on his buckskin gelding. The cabin was small and rough, but Owen had spent the last week cleaning and making improvements. There were curtains on the windows now, made by Emma herself, and wildflowers in a jar on the table. "It is not much," Owen said as he helped her down from the mare, "but I promise I will build you something better." Emma looked around at the cabin, at the corrals, at the prairie stretching out in all directions under a sky full of stars. "It is perfect," she said. "It is home." That first year of marriage was not easy. The territory was still raw, and making a living from ranching required long hours and hard work. Emma threw herself into building their life with the same determination she had brought to everything else. She kept the house, tended a garden, learned to milk the cow Owen bought her, and helped with the ranch work when he needed an extra pair of hands. But more than that, she became Owen's partner in every sense of the word. When he talked about expanding the herd, she helped him figure out the finances. When he struggled with a particularly stubborn horse, she offered suggestions from a different perspective. When he came in exhausted and discouraged after a long day, she reminded him why they were doing this, what they were building together. And Owen made sure Emma never felt invisible again. He asked her opinion and listened to her answers. He told her she was beautiful, even when she was covered in garden dirt. He held her when she woke from nightmares about being back in the orphanage, alone and forgotten. He saw her every day in all the ways that mattered. The following spring, Emma told him she was pregnant. Owen felt a terror he had not experienced since the day he staked his claim, racing across the prairie with hundreds of other settlers. But beneath the terror was joy, fierce and overwhelming. "I am scared," Emma admitted, her hand on her still flat stomach. "What if I am not a good mother? What if I do to our child what was done to me?" "You will not," Owen said with absolute certainty. "You know what it feels like to be invisible. You will spend your whole life making sure our child feels seen." Their son was born in December, a healthy boy with his mother's green eyes and his father's stubborn chin. They named him Thomas, after the teacher who had taught Emma to read. And from the moment Owen held him, he understood what Emma had meant about fear. He was terrified of failing this small, perfect person. But he was also determined to give Thomas everything he and Emma had never had. A home, stability, parents who loved him and each other. Emma took to motherhood with the same quiet competence she brought to everything else. She nursed Thomas and sang to him and made sure he knew, even as an infant, that he was loved and wanted. Owen would come in from the fields and find her talking to the baby, telling him stories about the prairie and the sky and all the things he would see as he grew. "He cannot understand you yet," Owen said one evening, watching from the doorway as Emma sat in the rocking chair he had made, Thomas drowsy in her arms. "He will," Emma said, looking up with a soft smile. "And even if he does not understand the words, he will understand that I am here, that I see him. That matters more than people think." As Thomas grew, the ranch grew with him. Owen expanded the herd, built new corrals, and added 2 rooms to the cabin. Emma's garden flourished and she started selling vegetables and preserves in town. They were not rich, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were happy. Frank and Caroline had settled into married life as well, their ranch adjoining Owen's land. The 2 couples became close, spending Sundays together and helping each other with the endless work of frontier life. Caroline and Emma became true friends, and watching Emma laugh and talk freely with another woman made Owen's heart glad. When Thomas was 2, Emma became pregnant again. This time, the fear was less, replaced by excitement. They were confident now, sure of themselves as parents and partners. Their daughter was born on a warm June evening with the windows open and the sound of crickets drifting in. She had Emma's brown hair and Owen's gray eyes, and they named her Rose after the wild roses that grew along the creek. Life fell into a rhythm, marked by the seasons and the growth of their children. Thomas learned to ride before he could read, sitting in front of Owen on the buckskin gelding and squealing with delight. Rose was quieter, more thoughtful, reminding Owen of Emma when he first met her. But where Emma had learned to make herself invisible, Rose was being taught to shine. The territory changed too. Oklahoma became a state in 1907, and Enid grew from a rough settlement into a proper town with paved streets and brick buildings. The general store expanded, and Mr. Peterson offered Emma a bookkeeping position that allowed her to work from home, bringing the ledgers to the ranch and working on them while the children napped. Owen watched his wife flourish in ways he could not have imagined when they first met. She was no longer the woman in gray who tried to disappear. She was vibrant and confident, secure in who she was and what she had built. She laughed easily now, her face lighting up in ways that still made his heart skip. She had opinions and voiced them. She had friends and spent time with them. She was visible, gloriously so, and Owen fell in love with her more deeply every day. On their 10th anniversary, Owen took Emma back to the creek where he had asked her to marry him. The children were with Frank and Caroline for the afternoon, giving them rare time alone. They sat on the same flat rock, Emma with her head on Owen's shoulder, watching the water flow past. "Do you remember what you said that day on the stagecoach?" Owen asked. "When I asked why you came to Enid, I said I had been invisible my whole life," Emma replied. "And I wanted to see if I could be different somewhere else. Are you different?" Emma was quiet for a long moment, and Owen could feel her breathing, steady and sure. "No," she finally said, and his heart sank until she continued. "I am not different. I am just finally myself. I was always this person, Owen. I just needed someone to see me so I could see myself. And now I know I was never really invisible. I just had not found my place yet, my people. I had not found you." She sat up and turned to face him, her green eyes clear and bright. "You gave me the greatest gift anyone can give another person. You paid attention. You looked at me and saw someone worth knowing, worth loving. You made me feel real." Owen cupped her face in his hands, these hands that had built their home and gentled wild horses and held their children. "You made me feel real too. Before you, I was just going through the motions, building something without knowing why. You gave me purpose. You gave me a reason to build a future instead of just surviving each day." They kissed as the sun sank lower, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. And when they rode back to the ranch, to their children and their life, Emma did not ride behind Owen or beside him. She rode with him, equal and seen and loved. The years continued to pass, marked by the milestones of any family. Thomas grew tall and serious, with his father's work ethic and his mother's kind heart. He took to ranching naturally, learning everything Owen could teach him about horses and cattle and reading the land. Rose was different, always with her nose in a book, dreaming of far-off places even as she loved the ranch fiercely. Emma encouraged her, teaching her that a woman could be many things at once. When Thomas was 16 and Rose 14, Emma's past came back in an unexpected way. A letter arrived from St. Louis, forwarded through Mrs. Henderson, from the boarding house where Emma had worked before coming to Oklahoma. The owner had died, and in her will, she had left Emma a sum of money and a letter. Emma opened it with shaking hands, Owen standing beside her for support. The letter was short but profound. The owner, Mrs. Abernathy, wrote that she had always seen something special in Emma, even when Emma could not see it herself. She had hoped Emma would find happiness, and the money was to ensure she could keep it. "She saw me," Emma whispered, tears streaming down her face. "All those years I thought no one noticed me, but she did. She saw me." "You mattered to more people than you knew," Owen said, holding her close. "You just could not see it because you had not learned to see yourself yet." They used the money to expand the ranch further. and to make sure both children could have educations beyond what the local school offered. Thomas eventually took over the ranch, marrying a woman from a neighboring homestead and starting his own family in the expanded cabin that was now a proper house. Rose went to the university in Norman, studying literature, and came home with ideas about starting a lending library in Enid. Owen and Emma, now in their 50s, stepped back from the daily running of the ranch but remained vital parts of the community. Emma did establish a lending library in what had been the original general store, and it became a gathering place for women and children. Owen trained horses and mentored young ranchers, passing on everything he had learned, but mostly, they simply enjoyed each other. After 30 years of marriage, they still sat by the creek on Sunday afternoons. They still held hands while walking through town. They still looked at each other like they were the only two people in the world, because in the ways that mattered, they were. "You ever regret it?" Emma asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky. "Taking a chance on a woman who was invisible." Owen looked at his wife, at the silver threading through her brown hair, at the lines around her eyes from years of laughter, at the strength and grace that had always been there but now shone clearly for anyone to see. "Never," he said. "You were never invisible, Emma. You just needed someone to strike a match so you could see yourself in the light, and once you did, you set the whole world on fire." She laughed, the sound rich and free, and leaned into his side. "We set it on fire together." As the years turned toward their 60s, Owen and Emma watched their family grow. Thomas and his wife had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, who ran wild on the ranch just as their father had. Rose married a lawyer from Enid and had twin daughters who inherited their grandmother's love of books. The original cabin, now surrounded by additions and improvements, rang with the sound of grandchildren during Sunday dinners. Emma thrived in her role as grandmother, but with none of the invisibility that had marked her early life. She was the center of the family, the one everyone came to with problems and joys. She had opinions about everything and shared them freely. She had grown into herself so completely that it was hard for Owen to remember the woman in gray who had stepped off the stagecoach 40 years ago. But he did remember, and it made him love her more, not less. He knew what she had overcome to become this person, the courage it had taken to remake herself in a new place. And he knew, with a certainty that had only deepened with time, that meeting her had been the luckiest moment of his life. On a cool October morning, similar to the day when Owen had first asked Emma to marry him, they rode out to their favorite spot by the creek. Owen was 70 now, Emma 68, and the ride took longer than it once had. But they still went, keeping the tradition they had started so many years ago. They sat on the flat rock, Emma's hand in Owen's, watching the water flow past just as it always had. The prairie grass was gold with autumn, and the air smelled of wood smoke and coming winter. "I have been thinking," Emma said, her voice still strong despite the years, "about how differently my life turned out from what I imagined. Better or worse, so much better. I thought if I could just be seen, if someone could just notice me, that would be enough. But what you gave me was so much more than that. You did not just see me, Owen, you helped me see myself. You gave me a place to belong, a family to love, a purpose beyond just existing. You gave me a life worth living." Owen raised her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "You gave me the same. Before you, I was building walls and calling it a life. You showed me what it meant to let someone in, to be vulnerable, to love and be loved. You made me whole." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun rose higher, warming the cool morning air. A hawk circled overhead, calling out to its mate. The creek burbled over stones worn smooth by time and water. And two people who had found each other against all odds sat together, still in love, still seeing each other clearly after all these years. "When we die," Emma said softly, "and people tell our story, I hope they remember this, that we saw each other when everyone else looked away, that we built something real and lasting out of loneliness and courage, that we proved you do not have to be remarkable to be loved. You just have to be willing to be seen." "They will remember," Owen promised. "Our children will tell our grandchildren, and they will tell their children, the story of the cowboy and the woman who was invisible and how they saw each other into being." Emma smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder just as she had done countless times before. "That is a good story. It is our story, the best one I know." Years later, when both Owen and Emma had passed peacefully in their sleep within months of each other, their grandchildren did indeed tell the story. They told it at family gatherings and to their own children. They told about the mail-order brides and the woman who had paid her own way, about the cowboy who had noticed when everyone else looked through her, about the life they had built together on the Oklahoma prairie. But the best testament to their love was not in the stories, but in what they had created. A family that valued each person, that made sure no one felt invisible, that understood the power of truly seeing someone. Thomas ran the ranch with fairness and compassion, teaching his own children the value of hard work and honest dealing. Rose's lending library became a permanent fixture in Enid, a place where everyone was welcome and every voice mattered. The creek where Owen and Emma had spent so many Sunday afternoons became a family landmark, a place where successive generations came to think and dream and remember. The house they had built together stood for nearly a century, sheltering children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, its walls holding echoes of laughter and love. And sometimes, on quiet Sunday afternoons when the light was just right, you could almost see them there on the rock by the creek. A cowboy and his bride, holding hands and watching the water flow past, still in love, still seeing each other clearly, still proving that the greatest gift you can give someone is to pay attention, to truly see them as they are, and to love them anyway. Because Emma had been right that day on the stagecoach. She had been invisible her whole life, overlooked and forgotten by almost everyone she met. But Owen had chosen to look, had chosen to see, and in doing so, he had given her the world. And she, in return, had given him purpose and love, and a reason to tear down his walls. They had saved each other, these two lonely people in a lonely land. And in saving each other, they had created something that lasted far beyond their own lives. A family, a legacy, a proof that love can bloom anywhere, even in the hardest soil if it is tended with care and attention. The prairie grass still grows golden in autumn around Enid, Oklahoma. The creek still flows past that flat rock, wearing it smooth year by year. And somewhere in the wind that blows across the land that Owen and Emma loved, you can still hear the echo of their story. The woman who had been invisible and the cowboy who chose to see her, building a life together one day at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of genuine seeing at a time. It was, in the end, exactly what both of them had needed. Not to become someone different, but to become fully themselves, seen and accepted and loved. And that, more than anything else, was what made their story remarkable. Not because they were extraordinary people, but because they were ordinary people who had the courage to be vulnerable with each other, to let themselves be seen in all their flawed humanity, and to build something lasting from that foundation. The land remembers them. The family remembers them. And every time someone chooses to really see another person, to look past the surface and recognize the humanity beneath, Owen and Emma's legacy continues. because that was their true gift to the world. Not the ranch or the library or even their children and grandchildren, but the example of what it means to choose love, to choose connection, to choose to see and be seen. And in a world that often feels invisible and cold, that is a legacy worth remembering.